this was a really fun story that unfortunately this interview about with this guy kind of this is what got blown out of proportion. Jim Ryan forced Shuhei Yoshida to take the PlayStation indie roles. Shuhei says, "I had no choice. It was take that job or leave the company." And then people got very mad because a lot of people aren't super happy with Jim Ryan. He's made some bad decisions. He was like really big on pushing for live service, which hasn't been popular among a lot of people. And of course, Concord, well, didn't do too well. So we're kind of seeing it as a failure here. And this is another thing that's Shuhei Yoshida was reportedly told to accept any role or leave the company. Ultimatum was brought by Jim Ryan, who replaced Shu with Herman Holtz. Yoshida moving from first party indies. Well, I had no choice. Shuhei's department from the head of the worldwide studios kicked off the live service era. So people holding a grudge against Jim Ryan and Herman Holtz for that. And this is I love pop-ups. This was by Games Beat. This was an interview that was done that this excerpt was taken from. I have some notes here that I thought it was kind of fun to go over it because this is a cool. It was a cool interview that kind of told you the story of Sony and some of the interesting, sort of obstacles that come through game development and working on new stuff and new technology. So I thought it'd be fun to go into it. Let me just take a drink. Revenge. So this was revenge in a toy at the time. Ken Kutari seeking revenge against Nintendo. If you don't know the story behind this, Sony was working with Nintendo to make a game console that involved CDs, and this is sort of infamous because what came out of it. Once they reneged on the deal, Sony ended up making PlayStation, which is a very big competitor to it, and Nintendo ended up having the Philips CD, which is just notoriously awful. The games that were produced for it, just stuff that was like retconned out of history. If you've ever looked up, Zelda CD, the Zelda CD games or CDRs or whatever they're called, or like the Mario ones, they basically get memed out of like crazy from YouTube poops. That it's yeah. It ended up it's one of these like Nintendo super fail type of things, historical levels of failure, as it did not work out for them. So seeking revenge against Nintendo for reneging on an agreement to work with Sony on a game console, pitched and won approval for creating the Sony PlayStation. Yoshida didn't believe Kutari could pull off his plan to do a workstation level 3D graphics on a $500 game console. But his former boss urged Yoshida to join, and he took the plunge into the unknown. Yoshida became one of the first 80 people to work on the PlayStation. The system debuted in 1994 in Japan and 1995 in the US. It turned out to be a huge hit, and Yoshida had to create a deck to impress Kutari's bosses. Some people viewed the PlayStation and this was kind of the interesting part, viewed it as a toy that would tarnish the Sony brand. Yoshida pitched the PlayStation as the world's first virtual reality system. Once Sony moved forward, Yoshida had to convince Japanese game developers and publishers to make games for the system. So to me, this is crazy to think. But I mean, when you think back, like nowadays, you look, video games are everywhere. Everyone's like, yeah, video games make a ton of money. It's just, an accepted part of the media landscape. But back in the day, there were people at Sony like, hey, this is a toy. Sony made these like sleek, video, they made like video players, televisions, these sound systems, these really sleek, high-end sound systems for people. Why are you making like a toy for this? So this is how video games were looked at. They were looked at as toys. So the fact that you had to like try and like pitch it as a virtual reality system, because I guess that was a super hot, tech, futuristic tech type of stuff, is how we had to like market this to people as. And this the potential new business, one of us was assigned to each of them. I wasn't assigned to Ken's project, but one of my colleagues was. He wasn't a gamer, I was advising him about which companies to look at, and this is Shuhei talking here. He wasn't a gamer. I advised him to which companies to look at. If it's 3D, you should talk to Namco. Things like that. I was a huge video game fan. Our boss at headquarters remembered so that I knew about games. Years later, when I was working at the PC department on notebooks, I got a call from him. He said I should meet with this guy, Ken Kutari. I met him, and Ken explained what he was working on. At the time, Silicon Graphics workstations were thousands of dollars. He said, I'm making a video game system that with the same power as a workstation. We'll sell it for $500. I said, well, that's great, but I didn't actually believe him. I went back to my old boss and said, Ken has to be lying. He said, no, seriously, I believe him. So I said, let me in. That's how I joined Ken's team in February of 1993. The interesting thing is 2 weeks after I joined Ken's team, he came in as Ken's boss. He was gathering people he knew that he thought he could use. It's amazing. He's like, nah, there's no way that you can make that for $500. He's like, nah, they could do it. Like, I'm in, guys. So Shuhei was always like a big video game fan from the start. So I put together a presentation saying that PlayStation would be the world's first virtual reality system. It's so funny that, guys, it's virtual reality system. It's not a console. This is what it's like. Namco was advertising Red Racer as a virtual reality experience. This isn't a video game. It's a virtual reality. It's so funny. Guys, it's not a video game. It's how I often forget, because it's been so long, that video games were looked down upon very heavily at the time. Virtual reality was a buzzword at the time. That was my first assignment. But my real job was to talk to publishers and developers in Japan and recruit them to make games for the PlayStation. I made phone calls to every company from Hokkaido to Kyushu and put together a tour plan. I brought all the leaders together, and a group of us visited each company to pitch 3D graphics and movie-like features. Very movie-like, if you remember the PlayStation's cutscene. Most companies, especially companies making games for Super Nintendo, didn't get it. They thought 3D graphics would only work for shooters and racing games. The kind of games that we were making, they didn't think they could use 3D. The PlayStation didn't have background memory or sprites. They didn't know how to make games any other way. But a couple of companies really loved it. Namco had already been made a lot of 3D arcade games, and they couldn't leverage it in the consumer business. They thought the PlayStation would be a great outlet for their games. So Namco, big in the arcades at the time, is starting to work with them on the PlayStation that will eventually, kind of end their arcade business. Unknowingly, I guess, end arcades. But it is so funny to see the stories of how a lot of these developers weren't really gung-ho on new technology or, learning new systems and new technology or how to do new things, which is kind of funny to think about. You'd always think, developers want to do the latest and greatest, but it's a lot of times, I guess it's not the case. Some other, like this, so Namco proposal was amazing. They designed their own proprietary hardware boards for arcade games. They had their own hardware development and manufacturing. However, the executive responsible said, I'd like to just use PlayStation as our next arcade board. They asked us to create an arcade board version of the PlayStation and ship them. The first game they made with it was Tekken. They made Tekken, released it in the arcades. 3 months later, they released it for consoles. That was the shortest time they ever had been able to convert an arcade game to a console. That was their strategy. They became our biggest ally. So Tekken, a huge part, and Namco, a huge part of the PlayStation success, as they almost effortlessly moved from arcade to console, I guess using the PlayStation board in their arcades. Some other PC-based developers also has been experimenting with 3D graphics on computers like the Sharp X 68000. Was a popular hobbyist PC that had some 3D capabilities. You had a small company, independent teams making 3D games on the PC. They jumped on the PlayStation. Some of them was a team that made Jumping Flash. So we were able to find some allies, but most of the major companies other than Namco preferred to wait and see. So this is a lot. It took some convincing. It's always fun looking back in hindsight and saying, of course it was a success. Why not? But for a lot of people, it's a huge risk. Like I mentioned, the Philips CD that Nintendo going with, it was a monumental failure. So this is, at the time, this was big because Square at the time, Squaresoft, was making some of the best Super Nintendo games of all time. I mean, this was sort of the golden era, in my opinion, of Square, was Super Nintendo. You had stuff like Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana. You had so many great games coming out, especially in the RPG department, from Square. So I became the lead account manager for Japanese publishers. Our goal was to get all major games in Japan to come out for the PlayStation. At the time, there were two big teams working with Nintendo, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, and these were different companies at the time, I believe. I don't think Square and Enix had merged. Enix was making Dragon Quest for the Japanese audience, and those were the most popular games. When a new one came out, you had long lines of customers waiting to buy them. It made national news when a new Dragon Quest came out. There was controversies over kids calling out sick from school to stay home and play games. So Dragon Quest was like Madden at the time, or Halo back in the day. Of course, initially they weren't interested. They were close to Nintendo. But Hironobu Shiguchi, the creator of Final Fantasy, loved the potential of CDs. His dream was to create a movie-like Final Fantasy game. He was disappointed when he learned that Nintendo 64 still used cartridges. His movies couldn't fit there. Squaresoft tried to convince Nintendo to change that plan, but they wouldn't. They didn't believe in CD-ROMs at all. Nintendo always sort of a late acceptor of new technology. That's why they licensed the Super Nintendo add-on project to Sony in the first place, because they believed CD-ROMs was just too slow to ever make a good game system. Well, that showed them. Our team, my boss, was a smoozer. He came from Sony Music. He hung out a lot with executives from Squaresoft, throwing parties at his apartment. Eventually, we were able to get Squaresoft to commit to PlayStation. They brought all their franchises from Nintendo to the PlayStation. Enix at the time was a separate company. They saw the move to PlayStation and decided to bring over Dragon Quest as well. So Squaresoft came over. Enix saw it and like, oh, I got what's happened over here, and they moved as well. They always wanted to release Dragon Quest on a console with the largest install base. So they were able to make the move. Getting Square and Enix was a huge win for PlayStation at the time. And I do remember that because I always loved, especially at the time when I was younger, I really enjoyed Square's games and their RPGs. Like I said, Chrono Trigger was amazing. Secret of Mana, all those such great games. And it was a big blow. Like, oh, they're going to PlayStation. Of course, we end up getting a PlayStation, so I played Final Fantasy VII on that anyway. But this was another interesting time that they were saved by flat screen TVs. Initially in Japan, the Sega Saturn was a very strong competitor. They had Virtual Fighter in the first year. The second year, they had Virtual Fighter 2. Those were popular among arcade games at the time until we announced Final Fantasy VII was coming out to the PlayStation. The Saturn was actually doing better. That was the most difficult time when we brought PlayStation to the US and Europe. They already had momentum. We announced that we were selling the system for $100 cheaper than Saturn, though. You see that pattern in different generations, like the 360 versus the PS3, and the Xbox One versus the PlayStation 4. That $100 makes a huge difference. So undercutting your competition by $100, it definitely helps. The US and European launches went very well. All the Japan launch titles were there, plus we had the US making sports games and European games like Wipeout. But the second year of the original PlayStation was very hard. It was very concerned. PlayStation 3 was another hard time. At the time, I was part of the management. I could see the financials. We were losing billions of dollars. I thought PlayStation was finished, but luckily, at the time, Sony's flat screen TVs were hugely popular. The TV group was making enough money to cover the losses from the PlayStation 3, and we were able to survive. So that's crazy that the PS3 was losing so much money that they were thankfully saved by flat screen televisions. But that was the most difficult time. Another one was the PSN outage. It lasted months. It's unbelievable how hard that was internally. And this is the sort of start. So again, crazy to think that PlayStation could have been finished if not for flat screen televisions being so popular. So Sony's other divisions making up for what the PS3 was losing. And this was another interesting thing that Sony, the start of the Sony Xbox console war. There was a CES dinner I went to. I also remember Ando-san was there. I asked him what he thought about Microsoft trying to get into the business with Xbox. He said that they had a nice launch, but by the time they sold their first unit, Sony had already sold 25 million PS2s. Of course, the PS2, one of the best-selling consoles of all time. That battle was almost over before Microsoft got started. So timing very important there. They launched very late. I remember the launch year of Xbox, the first one. Bill Gates came to Japan and did a keynote at the Tokyo Game Show. That showed they were serious. Part of what instigated them was Ken saying that the PlayStation, and this was really interesting. Ken said that the PlayStation was going to be the computer in the living room. That was the vision. Microsoft thought they were going to take the market away from them and decided they couldn't let that happen. So Microsoft coming in and like, what? They want to make a computer in every living room? We can't let this happen. What's I think ironic is that the console never became the computer in the living room. What ended up happening was that we got computers in our pockets with a smartphone. Apple kind of came in and actually won that the real computer war. Of course, PlayStation the PlayStations and these consoles end up becoming like Netflix streaming devices rather than a computer itself. In a way, Ken created our own competition when he said that. Later, Ken wanted us to become something like Intel, making cell processor. In his mind, he was always thinking bigger than the games business. This is another interesting thing about technology and how they adapted it. So, GamesBeat asked, did you have your own feelings about the cell processor at the time? What I knew before the launch was it was a supercomputer chip. Very powerful, but everyone in the games team and the engineering team said it was very hard to make games with it. By that time, there was no programming for multiprocessor. The programming is had to divide the game programming into smaller chunks and keep all that programming work synchronized. It was very hard. Would it still be considered hard today that everything is multi-core? Yeah. The industry changed, but when PS3 launched, it was the first time many programmers have faced that. Our graphics hardware was less powerful than the 360 as well. The NVIDIA chip. Mark Cherney and the Naughty Dog engineers would use the cell processor, which was powerful but hard to use, to help render the graphics. Part of the CPU would do the GPU's job. That became our internal game engine. So it's amazing to think, like, when you first come out with some new technology, just how hard it is for it to adapt. I guess this is another advantage of Nintendo's strategy is by the time everybody else works out these, kinks and details, they can come in the next generation like, oh yeah, that's a cool technology. Let's use that. And basically all the devs are used to working with it and everything's cool. It makes their job a lot easier. I remember when the Xbox group was starting up, one of the things the American developers said was they got no information from the Japanese company. They get dev kits very late and all the documentation was in Japanese. And then Yoshida says, that's a funny story. I didn't know if this was been published before, talking to PlayStation, but we were launching in Japan first. We start to sign licensing contracts with publishers and developers and send out dev kits, but only in Japan. Mark Cherney visited us and asked for a dev kit. I told him, no, we're only signing contracts for the Japanese developers right now. He said, well, can I become a Japanese developer? I said, sorry, we only have contracts written in Japanese. He said, that's no problem. Give me one. The next day, he came back with his signature on it. Crystal Dynamics, his U.S. company, became the first company with a dev kit. And Crystal Dynamics, famous for making the Tomb Raider series, which, hey, that worked out well for him. Later on, he told me what he had done. He hadn't consulted with the headquarters at all. He had just signed the deal himself and came back to the office with it. That caused some problems later on, but that's how we got our first dev kit for an American company. He could read Japanese, of course. He'd worked for Sega in Japan, worked with Yuji Naka to make Sonic the Hedgehog. He was able to take advantage of that. That's pretty funny. And this was the quote that everybody picked up on and everyone got mad about. And unfortunately, like, it wasn't like evil Jack Ryan forcing him to make indies. It's essentially when he got kind of moved out of his job, there wasn't a job for him. So it's either A, he has to quit, which is what would have been the option, but Jim Ryan ended up creating a spot for him to keep him in the company, essentially. So, GameSpeed Axer, why did you actually retire? Yoshida says, well, I haven't retired. I left the company. Jim Ryan was the last leader of our generation. Ken Katori, this is kind of weird what he says about, generations. Ken Katori, Kaza Ahiri, Andrew House, Sean Layden, myself, we were all the same group from the PS1 days. We handed down to the next generation of management. Like, this, it's again, it's really weird to see, like, you know what, my time's over, time to leave the company. Rather than, boomers holding on to power forever, which you seem to see in America, but maybe that's more of a Japanese thing, cultural thing. Like Hideki and Noshio and Herman Holtz. For the last 5 years, my responsibilities were to promote indie games inside and outside PlayStation. I wanted to communicate, especially to new people joining PlayStation, how important it was to support indie games. They create the future. Internally, I was communicating to indie developers and publishers that we wanted to make things better for them. Bit by bit, we were able to improve our system, our store functions, our communications. So it's cool to see that he realizes that indies right now is, where people innovate. They make new stuff, like new game types, and the fact that they're committed to helping these people out is really cool. A few years back, one of the reasons I got the job from Jim, we've been criticized by the indie community. They said PlayStation doesn't care about indies. You don't hear that kind of criticism anymore. Last year, we had a lot of anecdotes about our indie partners. Their new games were selling better on PlayStation than any other platform. That's amazing. Some games sold better on PlayStation than PC. When I started that work 5 years ago, our indie partners would say that when they released their games multi-platform, the Switch version would sell 3 to 5 times more than PlayStation. Yeah, Switch has definitely kind of cemented itself as like a great indie platform. People just walking around, they can just play on their couch. It does work very well for indies. Bit by bit, that gap has narrowed down. We have a strong team inside the company supporting indies. When I got the job, I told Jim I didn't want to create a department. There's enough verticals in the company. Coordinating department is hard already. I don't want to create another vertical. My personal goal when I started the indie job was to make the position obsolete. The company would be doing so well that there's no need for someone like me to tell everyone that this was important. I feel like we've achieved that pretty well. There's a lot we can do, but people working on it. You had the combination of Jim leaving and Noshido and Herman stepping up. I felt good about the state of our support for indies. I decided to leave. So he's like, I've been here long enough. It's time for me to move on, which is kind of cool. Did you face any handing from the developers? Did you face any personal challenges handing some of the biggest developers over to others to deal with? And then you went to focus on the smallest game companies. And this is the quote. Moving from first party indies, well, I had no choice. When Jim asked me to do the indies, the choice was to do that or leave the company. But I felt very strongly about the state of PlayStation indies. I wanted to do this. I believed I could do something unique for that purpose. That was the bigger change for me personally. Moving from first party indies, then leaving the company this year. I'm very lucky that the indie community, the publishers and developers I worked closely with, they believed that they could use my help. I became an advisor for some of these companies. I continued to work with some of the indie publishers. I respect the transition out of Sony became an independent advisor is less of a change than moving out of first party. And let me just move on here. There is more stuff, and he's going to continue to work as an advisor for indies, which is very cool. There was another interview with Colin Moriarty, and just some notes I took from it. That one thing he mentioned is that the Japanese market is insanely small, and Sony does not seem to really care too much about it. Like only 10% of their sales come from Japan. And I mean, Japan is a small, very small country, but they've always been very interested in video games. So the fact that it's only 10% is crazy, and the fact that, again, they're not like, it's 10%, it's not something that they specifically focus on, is kind of wild. And he also complained about how the Jack Ryan moving to Indies got, played out on the news. That's what the journalists decided to pick up and run with, that he was forced out by Jack Ryan. He said that he was happy to do the indie job. It was a fun thing for him to do, and he thought it was important. The other thing that he mentioned is that funding AA games is actually really hard because they're kind of like in the middle where, it's not like an indie, which has a very small budget, kind of like mid-sized budget, and the costs right now are just too high. It's either you got to go big with like a big AAA game that's going to sell like millions upon millions, or you need to go to an indie, which is kind of bizarre. Especially, I think the problem is that they never want to sell them for a certain price. They never want to. They never want to sell them for like $40. Like kind of like what they did with Helldivers. It's always like, here's a AAA game, AA game for like $60 or $70. Like I think that's one of the issues someone was mentioning with like Avowed. Avowed feels like a AA game, but they want to charge $70 for it because it doesn't have a lot of these technical chops that like something like Skyrim had back in the day. Not a lot of interaction. It's fairly bare bones in terms of like the NPCs don't move around. They don't have like walk cycles, day night cycles. They just sort of stay there. A lot of people are saying, it's an all right game. It's just not a $70 game. So that could be one of the issues why Valve's not doing super well. And then he also mentioned the increased cost development made exclusives less viable, and putting things on PC has proven not to eat profits away from Sony. Though he didn't specifically say about releasing stuff, day and date, which means releasing them simultaneously PC and PlayStation. He mentioned like, releasing it later on PC has just been an absolute win. It's just more money for them. It's nothing that, it's nothing that they, think, takes away from their profits. It just adds to their profits. So the days of exclusivity may be ending for consoles.